Before we talk about meaning, we need to confront a far more uncomfortable possibility. What if most people are not afraid that life is meaningless at all? What if the fear hiding beneath our ambitions, our goals, our endless self-improvement projects, is something much smaller and much more personal? What if the real terror is being ordinary? Think about that for a moment. If someone offered you two futures, which would you choose? In the first, your life has no grand purpose. No cosmic significance. No guarantee that anything you do will echo through history. In the second, your life has meaning, but you will never stand out. Never be exceptional. Never be remembered beyond a handful of people. Which future feels heavier? Which one creates that subtle tension in your chest? Most people answer too quickly. And that's exactly why this question matters. For centuries, philosophers have argued that human beings are searching for meaning. We tell ourselves that our careers, our relationships, our sacrifices, and our dreams are all part of that search. But when you look closely at how people actually behave, a strange contradiction appears. People often abandon truth for recognition. They sacrifice peace for status. They trade fulfillment for visibility. And the more connected our world becomes, the more obvious this contradiction gets. Why? Because meaning and significance are not the same thing. You can live a deeply meaningful life without becoming important. You can raise a family, help your community, love deeply, and disappear from history without a trace. Yet for many people, that possibility feels strangely unbearable. Not because it lacks meaning, but because it lacks distinction. And that raises a disturbing question. If meaning is what we claim to want, why are we so obsessed with being seen? Imagine a giant auditorium. Thousands of seats stretching into darkness. A spotlight shines onto a single empty chair at the center of the stage. No applause. No audience. No recognition. Just silence. That image unsettles many people more than they expect. Not because something bad happened, but because nothing happened. No witness. No proof. No confirmation that their existence mattered. That empty chair is more than a symbol. It is a psychological mirror. The modern world has learned how to exploit that fear. Every notification, every follow account, every comparison, every carefully curated image whispers the same message: your value depends on your visibility. The game changes shape, but the underlying promise remains. Be noticed, and you matter. Be ignored, and perhaps you never mattered at all. But here is where the mystery deepens. If recognition truly satisfies us, why do so many successful people continue chasing more of it? Why does achievement so often produce relief that lasts only days, sometimes only hours? Why do people who reach the top frequently discover another mountain waiting behind it? The answer may reveal something uncomfortable about human nature. Perhaps the search for meaning is not always what it appears to be. Perhaps beneath many of our ambitions lives another force entirely, a quieter force, rarely acknowledged, constantly active. A force that does not ask, does my life have meaning, but instead asks, am I more than ordinary? And if that is true, then we are no longer dealing with a philosophical problem. We are dealing with a psychological one. Because the question is no longer whether life has meaning. The question is why being ordinary feels so much like disappearing. If being ordinary feels so threatening, then we have to ask a deeper question: where did this fear come from in the first place? After all, there was a time when most people expected to live anonymous lives. They worked, loved, struggled, raised children, grew old, and disappeared without imagining that millions of strangers should know their names. Yet today, something feels different. Not because human nature changed, but because the environment around human nature changed. And that distinction matters. The modern individual lives inside a comparison machine unlike anything in history. For thousands of years, people compared themselves to neighbors, co-workers, family members, or perhaps the most successful person in town. Today, before breakfast, someone can compare their appearance to celebrities, their income to Entrepreneurs, their relationships to influencers, and their achievements to people they have never met. The scale has changed. But here is the contradiction. We often assume comparison is about envy. In reality, it may be about identity. How do you know who you are? Most people answer that question by looking inward. But psychologically, human beings often discover themselves by looking outward. We measure, evaluate, rank, and position ourselves within a social landscape. The problem is that the landscape never stops expanding. And when the landscape becomes infinite, so does the feeling of inadequacy. This creates a strange psychological trap. The more opportunities a society offers for distinction, the more difficult distinction becomes. Everyone is encouraged to be unique. Everyone is told to stand out. Everyone is told to become extraordinary. But if everyone is extraordinary, what happens to the meaning of the word? Notice the hidden contradiction. A culture obsessed with uniqueness often produces people who feel interchangeable. A culture obsessed with visibility often produces people who feel unseen. A culture obsessed with self-expression often produces people who quietly wonder whether their real self is enough. That question sits beneath more behavior than we realize. Consider another image. A gold medal resting alone in a dusty drawer. Years ago, it represented victory, recognition, proof. Yet now it sits in darkness, untouched. The object did not change. The achievement did not disappear. So why does its emotional power fade? Because recognition has a strange property. It must constantly be renewed. This is where the conflict becomes more serious. If self-worth depends on external confirmation, then every achievement eventually expires. Every accomplishment becomes temporary. Every victory creates a new standard. What once felt exceptional becomes normal. What once felt sufficient becomes inadequate. And that means the race never truly ends. The striver, the figure we introduced earlier, does not suffer because they lack success. They suffer because success cannot solve the problem they are using it to solve. Their role is not simply to achieve. Their role is to escape the feeling of insignificance. Yet the more they run, the more elusive significance becomes. That is the mystery. The thing being pursued and the thing actually needed may not be the same. This pattern appears everywhere. Careers, status, wealth, influence. Even personal growth can become part of the same cycle. A person can spend years improving themselves while secretly serving the same fear that drove them from the beginning. Not the fear of failure. Not even the fear of meaninglessness. The fear of becoming invisible. And once you see that pattern, the question becomes impossible to ignore. If achievement cannot permanently satisfy the hunger for significance, then what exactly is this hunger trying to feed, and why does it seem to grow stronger the more we give it? What if the hunger itself is the problem? Not because it is evil. Not because ambition is wrong. But because the mind may be asking a question that reality was never designed to answer. Think about what happens when a person ties their value to distinction. At first, the logic seems reasonable. If I achieve more, I will feel more valuable. If I become exceptional, I will feel secure. If enough people recognize me, I will finally know who I am. But hidden inside that belief is a contradiction powerful enough to shape entire lives. Distinction only exists relative to other people. You cannot be exceptional in isolation. You cannot be superior without comparison. You cannot be admired without an audience. And the moment your worth depends on comparison, your identity becomes vulnerable to forces you cannot control. This is where the crisis begins. Because the game appears winnable from a distance. Yet up close, the rules keep changing. Imagine climbing a mountain whose summit moves every time you get closer. Every achievement creates a new standard. Every milestone creates a new expectation. Every victory quietly destroys the satisfaction that came before it. The person who once dreamed of making $100,000 a year begins comparing themselves to someone making $1 million. The person who once wanted 1,000 followers begins comparing themselves to someone with 100,000. The person who once wanted recognition begins competing with people who seem impossible to catch. The goal keeps moving. But the deeper contradiction is even stranger. The mind interprets this movement as evidence that the answer is still ahead. Just one more accomplishment. One more breakthrough. One more level. One more audience. Yet every step forward seems to strengthen the hunger instead of satisfying it. Why? Because the pursuit is attempting to solve an existential problem with social rewards. And social rewards were never designed to create lasting certainty. This is why some of the most admired people in history remained restless. Not because they lacked achievement, but because achievement could not answer the question hiding underneath achievement. The question was never, how high can I climb? The question was, am I enough? And those are completely different questions. Now the scale shifts. What begins as a private struggle eventually becomes a cultural system. Entire industries emerge around the promise of significance. Marketing sells distinction. Status symbols sell distinction. Personal brands sell distinction. Even self-improvement can sometimes become a refined pursuit of distinction disguised as growth. Notice the pattern. A civilization built around visibility naturally creates anxiety about invisibility. A civilization obsessed with uniqueness naturally creates fear of being average. A civilization that constantly measures people eventually teaches people to measure themselves. And once that happens, the judge moves inside the mind. That internal judge becomes one of the most influential characters in this story. Its role is simple. To compare. To evaluate. To rank. To ask whether you are ahead or behind. Its influence extends into careers, relationships, identity, and self-worth. Yet its greatest contradiction is that it promises peace while generating constant tension. Its legacy is a population that often feels insufficient despite unprecedented opportunity. And its mystery remains largely unnoticed because most people mistake its voice for their own. Consider another image. A name carved into stone. 4 generations, that name might have represented achievement, status, importance, legacy. Then centuries pass. The stone erodes. The letters fade. Eventually, nobody remembers who that person was. This is not a tragedy. It is a reality. And reality introduces a question that the pursuit of distinction cannot easily answer. If recognition eventually disappears, if status eventually disappears, if comparison never truly ends, then perhaps the deepest source of our anxiety is not that we are ordinary. Perhaps it is that we are trying to build permanence out of things that were never meant to last. And if that is true, then the fear we have been examining may not be the deepest layer at all. Because beneath the fear of being ordinary may be an even older fear. The fear of becoming forgettable in a universe that does not guarantee remembrance. What if the fear of being forgotten is not the root of the problem either? What if it is only a symptom pointing toward something even deeper? This is where the picture begins to change. Up to this point, it has been tempting to view the human struggle as a conflict between significance and insignificance, recognition and obscurity, visibility and invisibility. But those opposites may be distracting us from a more important revelation. The deeper issue is not whether other people remember us. The deeper issue is whether we can recognize value without comparison. Most people never consciously ask that question. They spend years measuring themselves against external standards without noticing the hidden assumption underneath the measurement. The assumption is that value must be earned, proven, displayed, and confirmed. Yet that assumption creates a paradox. Anything that must constantly be proven can never feel secure. Anything that depends on evidence can always be questioned. Anything that relies on comparison can always be surpassed. This is why the pursuit often becomes exhausting. Not because people are weak, but because they are trying to satisfy a need through a mechanism that generates more need. Imagine a mirror that only reflects your image when someone else is standing beside you. Alone, the reflection disappears. That mirror becomes a powerful symbol of modern identity. Many people know who they are only relative to someone else. More successful. Less successful. More attractive. Less attractive. More respected. Less respected. Their sense of self is constructed through contrast. And yet the moment identity depends on contrast, stability becomes impossible. Here the role of the internal judge becomes clearer. Its influence extends far beyond ambition. It quietly transforms life into an endless evaluation. Experiences become performance. Relationships become validation. Growth becomes evidence. Even happiness can become another achievement to display. The contradiction is subtle but devastating. The individual believes they are pursuing fulfillment, while the underlying system keeps redirecting attention toward measurement. This creates consequences that extend beyond personal psychology. Entire societies begin organizing around symbolic value. Attention becomes currency. Visibility becomes status. Perception becomes power. The result is not merely a collection of anxious individuals. The result is a civilization increasingly dependent on external signals to determine internal worth. Scale the pattern outward and the implications become even more profound. Institutions reward visibility. Algorithms reward visibility. Cultural narratives reward visibility. Over time, a society can begin confusing importance with exposure. The most visible voices appear most significant. The most public achievements appear most meaningful. Yet visibility and value are not identical. Exposure and wisdom are not identical. Attention and truth are not identical. This is where another memory fragment emerges. Picture an ancient lighthouse standing alone on a rocky coastline. For decades it guided ships through darkness. It saved lives. It fulfilled its purpose. Yet most of the people it helped never knew its name. Its value existed independently of recognition. That image challenges a deeply embedded assumption. Perhaps significance is not created by being seen. Perhaps significance is created by what something contributes, whether it is seen or not. If that possibility is true, then an extraordinary reversal begins to appear. The most dangerous illusion may not be believing that we are ordinary. The most dangerous illusion may be believing that value requires an audience. And if that is true, then we are approaching a revelation that changes the entire framework. Because the real question may no longer be why people chase recognition. The real question is what kind of self remains when recognition is removed entirely. What remains when every external measure of value is stripped away? That is the question hidden beneath everything we have explored so far. Not the question of achievement. Not the question of status. Not even the question of recognition. The deeper question concerns the foundation itself. What is the source of human worth if it cannot be secured through comparison, performance, visibility, or remembrance? Here we arrive at the central revelation. The fear that drives so much striving is not actually a fear of being ordinary. It is a fear that without distinction, there is nothing left to justify our existence. That is the assumption operating beneath the surface. And once you see it, an extraordinary contradiction appears. Human beings often spend years trying to prove a value they already possess. The internal judge, the silent evaluator that has followed us throughout this journey, operates according to a specific rule. It assumes worth must be earned. It assumes existence requires justification. It assumes value is conditional. But what if that assumption is false? What if the entire structure of endless comparison is built upon a misunderstanding of what worth actually is? Consider a newborn child. Nobody asks whether that child has accumulated achievements. Nobody asks about status, influence, audience size, or social rank. The child possesses value before accomplishment enters the picture. Yet somewhere along the path into adulthood, many people begin accepting a different story. A story that says value must be demonstrated. A story that says worth must be measured. A story that quietly transforms life into an endless audition. This is the revelation many people overlook. The pursuit of significance is often an attempt to solve a problem created by a belief rather than by reality itself. The belief is that ordinary existence is insufficient. The belief is that being human is not enough. The belief is that value arrives after validation. But the consequence of that belief is profound. Once worth becomes conditional, there is never enough evidence to satisfy the demand. Every accomplishment becomes temporary proof. Every compliment becomes temporary proof. Every milestone becomes temporary proof. The system cannot produce security because insecurity is the fuel that keeps the system running. This changes how we understand the characters within our story. The striver is no longer simply chasing success. The striver is attempting to obtain permission to feel worthy. The internal judge is no longer simply comparing. It is enforcing a hidden contract that says value must be earned. The witness, however, serves a different role. The witness recognizes the contract itself. Its influence comes not from winning the game but from seeing the game. That distinction matters because awareness creates the possibility of freedom. Here another memory fragment emerges. Imagine an old lighthouse once more. Not because it was seen. Not because it was celebrated. Not because ships praised it. Its purpose existed independently of recognition. Its contribution was real whether applause followed or not. The symbol points toward a different understanding of value. Something can matter without being famous. Something can be meaningful without being extraordinary. Something can possess worth without being compared. Scale this insight beyond the individual and the implications become enormous. Entire cultures built on competition begin to look different. Entire systems built on external validation begin to reveal their limitations. Entire identities built on distinction begin to appear fragile. The deepest shift is philosophical. Perhaps the opposite of insignificance is not importance. Perhaps the opposite of insignificance is presence. To fully inhabit one's existence without requiring constant confirmation from others. But if a civilization increasingly teaches people to seek worth through visibility, achievement, and comparison, then what are the long-term consequences of that belief? And what kind of society emerges when millions of people spend their lives trying to earn something that may never have required earning in the first place? The consequences of a false definition of worth do not end with the individual. They ripple outward, shaping relationships, institutions, cultures, and eventually entire civilizations. Once a person begins believing that value must be earned through distinction, life quietly changes direction. Decisions that appear rational on the surface become guided by an invisible objective underneath. Careers are chosen not only for contribution but for status. Relationships are pursued not only for connection but for validation. Goals are pursued not only for fulfillment but for proof. The consequence is subtle because the behavior itself often looks admirable. Hard work, discipline, achievement, ambition. None of these are inherently harmful. The problem emerges when they become instruments in a deeper struggle for self-justification. In that condition, success no longer functions as an expression of identity. It becomes a defense against insecurity. And anything built as a defense eventually demands maintenance. This is why so many people feel trapped inside lives they spent years constructing. The external structure may appear impressive while the internal foundation remains fragile. The consequence is not simply exhaustion. It is alienation. A gradual separation from one's own experience. The individual becomes skilled at managing appearances while losing contact with presence. Yet the story becomes even larger when we examine its legacy. Every generation inherits a set of assumptions about value. Some assumptions remain invisible because they are woven into everyday life. A child observes what receives attention. A teenager observes what receives admiration. An adult observes what receives rewards. Over time, a culture transmits a philosophy without ever calling it philosophy. The message becomes simple. Be more. Achieve more. Accumulate more. Become more visible. Become more important. The legacy of this message extends far beyond personal anxiety. It creates systems that reward comparison and amplify dissatisfaction. Entire economies learn how to monetize insecurity. Entire industries emerge around helping people feel more significant, more exceptional, more desirable, more visible. Yet the paradox remains. The greater the collective pursuit of distinction becomes, the rarer genuine contentment appears to be. This creates one of the most revealing memory fragments in our story. Imagine a person awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, staring at a glowing screen in a dark room. They are not searching for information. They are not solving a problem. They are checking for evidence. Evidence that they matter. Evidence that they were noticed. Evidence that they have not disappeared into the background. The image feels familiar because it captures something larger than technology. It captures a civilization increasingly dependent on external confirmation. Now shift the scale again. Consider the empty chair in the vast auditorium. Consider the faded name on the weathered stone. Consider the gold medal gathering dust in a forgotten drawer. Consider the lighthouse standing on the coastline, continuing its purpose whether anyone celebrates it or not. Together these symbols reveal two competing legacies. One legacy teaches that value depends upon recognition. The other suggests that value may exist independently of recognition. One produces endless striving. The other points toward a different relationship with existence itself. The question is not which philosophy sounds better. The question is which philosophy survives contact with reality. Because every audience eventually leaves. Every trend eventually fades. Every status hierarchy eventually changes. Every reputation eventually passes into other hands. Yet something remains. Something persists beneath comparison, beneath performance, beneath visibility. The mystery is that most people spend their lives looking past it because it appears too ordinary to be important. And perhaps that is the final paradox before we reach the end of this journey. What if the thing we have been trying to escape for our entire lives is actually the doorway to the freedom we have been searching for all along? The most enduring ideas are rarely the ones that give us answers. They are the ones that permanently change the questions we ask ourselves. And perhaps that is where this journey ultimately leads. Not toward a new achievement. Not toward a new identity. Not even toward a final explanation. But toward a different way of seeing. Throughout human history, people have built monuments, written books, founded companies, created art, accumulated wealth, chased influence, and searched for some lasting proof that their existence mattered. Yet the deeper lesson hidden beneath those efforts may not concern success at all. It may concern our relationship with ourselves when success is absent. Because eventually, every external marker begins to fade. The audience leaves. The applause ends. The rankings change. The headlines disappear. The trends move on. Time performs the same quiet act upon every generation. What remains is not the image we projected into the world. What remains is the quality of our relationship with existence itself. This is why the symbols that accompanied us through this story feel strangely powerful. The empty chair in the vast auditorium. The weathered name fading from stone. The forgotten medal resting in darkness. The person staring into a glowing screen long after midnight. The lighthouse standing against the shoreline. These are not merely images. They are mirrors reflecting different possibilities of what it means to be human. Some reveal the fragility of a life built entirely upon recognition. Others point toward a form of value that does not depend upon being witnessed. Their significance lies not in what they represent individually, but in the tension between them. That tension is still alive in modern life. Every day, people navigate a world that encourages performance while longing for authenticity. They seek distinction while craving belonging. They pursue visibility while searching for peace. They want to be seen, yet they also want to be accepted without having to prove themselves. Perhaps that contradiction is not a flaw in human nature. Perhaps it is one of its defining features. The legacy of this insight extends far beyond personal psychology. It touches education, culture, technology, leadership, relationships, and the story civilizations tell about what makes a life worthwhile. Because whenever a society confuses attention with value, people begin measuring themselves through unstable standards. But whenever people discover value that exists independently of comparison, something remarkable becomes possible. Not perfection. Not certainty. Not immunity from doubt. Something quieter. A different kind of freedom. The freedom to contribute without needing constant recognition. The freedom to create without demanding immortality. The freedom to participate in life without turning every experience into a referendum on personal worth. And perhaps that is why this question refuses to disappear. It is not really about ambition. It is not really about achievement. It is not even really about significance. It is about whether a human being can stand in the presence of an ordinary life and still recognize something sacred there. Because if value does not originate from visibility, and if meaning does not require superiority, then the entire landscape changes. The ordinary person is no longer a failed version of someone extraordinary. The ordinary person becomes something else entirely. A reminder that existence may possess worth before it acquires distinction. And if that possibility is true, then perhaps the most important question is not whether we will be remembered. Perhaps the more difficult question is this: if no audience were left to judge us, compare us, celebrate us, or forget us, would we still be able to recognize the value of simply being here?